Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. I'm on Soho Square in front of this statue of King Charles II, King of Ireland, King of Scots, King of England, and putatively King of France. So this is one of very few likenesses of him on display in the British Isles. So in some ways a contentious figure, but his reign provided a brief respite between the upheavals of the English Civil War and the British Republic on one hand, and later on James II's ill-fated reign that came right after him and the so-called Glorious Revolution. So Charles II, he was born here in London in 1630. His father was King Charles I. His mother was Queen Henrietta Maria, so she's a French princess. And so he rose to maturity well in a time of growing tension. Shan't go through a blow-by-blow account of his father's reign, but there's the personal rule of Charles I, who firmly believed in the divine right of kings and Arminianism, as in that Dutch Reformed Church theologian who said, well, he quoted the Book of Psalms, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness, believed in bringing back ritual and resplendence to the church, but remaining a Reformed Christian, not a Roman Catholic. I say Reformed advisedly rather than Protestant, because Charles I's proclivities were not really Protestant. Yes, the Pope wasn't head of his church, but there was always a suspicion that, the visuals of his form of worship were suspiciously similar to Roman Catholicism, and there was a lot of vicious anti-Catholicism in the country at the time. Of course, Charles II's mother was a Catholic, and his uncle, King Louis XIII of France, had simply arrested pesky politicians in France and had them beheaded, closed the Estates General. It didn't meet for 175 years. Anyway, 1642, the English Civil War broke out. Parliamentarians versus Royalists. Parliamentarians, also known as Roundheads, the Royalists, also known as Cavaliers. So Charles II was evacuated to Jersey for his safety, but one of his younger siblings, the Duke of Gloucester, was in a palace, in a castle that was invested by the Parliamentarians, taken prisoner by them when he was little. They didn't harm him, but they considered using him as a puppet king. Didn't happen in the end. So Charles II, when he's an adolescent, he had a liaison with Lucy Walters, who was a high-born girl, but who didn't mind having a child out of wedlock because she was the mistress of the Prince of Wales. So she knew that he was never going to marry her. And obviously, being born outside of matrimony was considered a disgrace back in those days. People were very unfair, but and also giving birth to a child if you weren't married was considered shameful. But if the father was the Prince of Wales, well, that changed things. That was still more honourable than being an average middle-class married woman. So this child was called James Scott, although there is actually some dispute over the paternity. Why Scott? I suppose the Stuarts, his dynasty, had come down from Scotland. Anyway, he was in the Netherlands later on. So his father was executed in 1649. And, it's a highly complex topic, the wars of the British Isles. The English Civil War was also fought in Ireland and Scotland and Wales, but we tend to call it English Civil War. So he made an agreement with the Scots Covenanters, those who signed a covenant to defend the Church of Scotland, saying he accepted his father had been dead wrong about the Book of Common Prayer. He was no longer going to impose that sort of Anglican worship on them, and the Church of Scotland could be Presbyterian, could have elders, it's presbyteros in ancient Greek, didn't have to have bishops like episcopus in ancient Greek. That's why the Episcopalian Church is called that, because they got bishops, which are in a Reformed Church is unusual. The Church of England has bishops and archbishops. Now, for hardcore Protestants, that's too similar to Catholicism. They don't like using the same nomenclature. Anyhow, so he accepted that, and some of these Covenanters, they made an engagement with him. They were engagers, as they say. He came back to Scotland, he was on their side, and he got down into England for the Battle of Worcester, and he was soundly thrashed. So he fled in disguise, and a poster was put out, a wanted poster for Charles Stuart, 2 yards high, as in 6 foot tall. Now that's notably above average height these days, but back then that was almost gigantic. People were much smaller in those days, often had rickets, didn't have sufficient calcium and protein growing up, and of course, just through evolution, we've got a bit taller in the last 350 years. So he went to Boscobel House and he had to hide in an oak tree there whilst parliamentarian troops were scouring the place for him. That's why there's many a public house called the Royal Oak. And if you look on the side of such alehouses, you'll see a face peeping out from behind the leaves. Not a lot of people know that. And that's our warships called HMS Royal Oak. Anyway, he made good to his escape. He fled to the Netherlands, but events turned in his favour. Though he'd failed to make a comeback, he had been crowned King of Scots at Scone Palace, the traditional place where King of Scots are crowned. Remember, Scotland, England, Ireland were all separate kingdoms. Wales was a principality attached to England. But Cromwell died. He was briefly replaced by a son, Tumbledown Dick, a singularly ineffectual chap who was pressurised into resigning. Remember, Oliver Cromwell and his son, Richard Cromwell, they didn't rule as king, though Oliver Cromwell pondered it very seriously. He felt that England needed a monarch. Every country had a monarch. Should he do this? But no, people would think that he had overthrown Charles I for selfish reasons of personal ambition and glory. No, he'd done it because he was actuated by his duty and his religiosity, so he claimed. So he wouldn't do that. He'd be Lord Protector. He revived a title which regents had used in previous interregnums, or when the monarch was an infant or mentally incapacitated. Anyhow, so Richard Cromwell stood down as Lord Protector as well, and then George Monk became Lord Protector. George Monk had been a royalist general who'd been forgiven by Cromwell and let out of prison in order to go and fight the remaining royalists in Ireland, the Confederation of Kilkenny. But George Monk, then he helped persuade Parliament, the Cavalier Parliament, to vote to bring back Charles II rather. So and they wrote to him in the Netherlands. He was in Breda. He gave the Declaration of Breda, saying that he absolved his father's foes. He would not seek to exact any vengeance on them, and he accepted the new political settlement, certain limitations on the regal prerogative. And so he came back bloodlessly. And so George Monk was then made Duke of Albemarle. That was as thank you for what he'd done. Now, in a typical Stuart fashion, he swiftly reneged on all these solemn promises, and he hunted down and had executed many of those who had been the commissioners who signed his father's death warrant and so on, often hanged, drawn and quartered. Some of them fled abroad as far as America. A few of them were forgiven, though. George Downing, Chancellor Exchequer, is an Irishman, or at least born in Ireland. Anyhow, Downing Street's named after him, and he turned his coat and he helped hunt down his former comrades, former parliamentarians. So that's that. Oliver Cromwell was disinterred 2 years after his death. He's put on trial. Now, he was asked various questions and he failed to answer. Well, I mean, as he didn't plead, that was obviously taken as a guilty plea. And then he was sentenced to die again. And his dead body was executed, hanged, drawn and quartered and the rest of it. And the head thrown into a ditch in Houndsditch, city of London. It was later rescued and passed around through various families, till finally in 1954 it was reburied at Sidney Sussex College, his old college in Cambridge. So Charles II, he ushered in a more joyous era. He was a rumbustious sort. He was certainly a bon viveur, or bon vivant I should say, believed in enjoying the finer things of life, a reprobate. So and he lived in splendour and liked wearing silk, and he brought in this fashion for these shoulder-length wigs. So that was it. After the very austere and bland Puritanism of Cromwell, this was a very welcome breath of fresh air. So he married Catherine Braganza, this Portuguese princess. She bought him a handsome dowry in the shape of Mumbai. But back then it was Bombay, Bombaia, as in good bay, a Portuguese possession on the coast of India. And of course its value was not fully appreciated at first. She requested not to drink beer. Everyone else here drank small beer because the river water was so foul could kill you. Even children drank beer, like sort of 1% alcohol, so they were hardened to it. She requested tea. What's that? A China drink. And she introduced this tea drinking tradition here. The Portuguese were trading with China before the English. Anyhow, he had 20 children. The only trouble is none of them with his wife. So he had many mistresses, normally from high-born families, but some of them, Nell Gwyn, came from a humbler family. Indeed, his last words were, "Let not poor Nelly starve." It was known that he had a Roman Catholic mistress as well as a Protestant mistress. And Nell Gwyn turned up one time in a coach and four, coming to the palace, and there's a crowd outside jeering her because they were anti-Catholic bigots, and she stuck her head out the window. "I'm the Protestant whore." Well, that's all right then. So he did not abandon the fruit of his loins. These children, the boys were given aristocratic titles, and the girls, well, he would later order an aristocrat to marry them, and that's that. And quite a lot of the British nobility is descended from his unchaste loins. What else about him? And in 1666, well, the Great Fire of London broke out at Pudding Mill Lane. You can see a monument where it happened, and of course it was blamed on papists, or Roman Catholics that is. but I don't think that's true, as yet to direct operations. But some people thought this was divine retribution. It was the judgment of heaven on his wickedry, on his iniquity, his constant fornication. And anyway, and people were mindful of the year 1666, and the number of the beast shall be 666. So saith the book of Revelation. Well, you can't argue with the divinely inspired word of the Lord. But anyway, when it was put out after a while, first of all, someone had said a woman might pish it out. But at least it did bring an end to the plague, which had been ravaging London. And so many people had died of bubonic plague. They thought it was cats and dogs, and they started killing cats and dogs, offering a reward for that, which of course aggravated the problem, because the cats and dogs were killing some of the rats, and it was fleas on rats bite people, and then you get buboes, these swellings of the lymph nodes, in the throat, the armpits, the groin. They then should turn black and burst when the pus comes out and kills most people affected. Some survive though. So it obviously mostly densely populated places with ships coming in and out, had most rats coming in and out. People who sent packets of clothes to elsewhere, that could spread it, because Royal Mail was operating by then. They didn't have the penny post. So that was that, and then he had Sir Christopher Wren to rebuild St Paul's Cathedral on the same site, and Wren tried to make the city a bit more Italianate. There were some plots against him, some parliamentarian plots in the early days. That was that. So people became very concerned, as his wife was barren, as they said rather brutally at the time. She was a Catholic, of course, because so what to do? Well. His younger brother was James II. So James II converted to Roman Catholicism. Was he going to be allowed to come? Oh my goodness. He would bring back in Catholicism, wouldn't he? So some people didn't want that. A Catholic monarch. Could a Catholic monarch rule a Protestant country? Surely this wasn't to be. Well, Mary, Queen of Scots, had tried it, and we remember how that ended. So Parliament was summoned sometimes, and there was the Oxford Parliament of 1681, which led to the exclusion crisis. And some people wanted to pass a bill to exclude James II, Charles II's younger brother, from the succession on the grounds of his Catholicism, because the monarch had to be head and supreme governor of the Church of England, and indeed of Scotland, and indeed of Ireland. But of course in Ireland we had a different parliament, so did the Scots. But talk about the Parliament of England and Wales. So eventually that was passed by the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but it went to the King. He had to sign it, and he said, no, I shall not sign. So some who wanted to exclude James II was known as excluders. Those who did not were called as abhorrers, as in they abhorred the idea of ruling out James II. And the Oxford Parliament, he said, no, I'm not going to do it. He did have a minority on his side in Parliament. What are you going to do? Do you want another civil war? Well, nobody in his right mind wanted that. They wanted normality. So they backed down, and that was that. Finally, in 1685, it became clear he was ill. He'd done so much to bring back gaiety to this country, make it merry England once more. That's why there's so much drama from his era. But he died in 1685 and was succeeded by his brother, James II. He converted to Catholicism right on his deathbed. Well, I won't go into what happened to James II. So that is Charles II, a fascinating figure, not quite pivotal figure in the history of this country. Made things better in some regards. Perhaps should have achieved more reconciliation here. It wasn't an anti-Catholic bigot, so many people were at the time. It was fairly good for Ireland. That's Charles II.